buttons now. Okay, you're all set.
All right. On behalf of the Seattle Planning Commission, we'd like to actively recognize that we are on Indigenous land, the traditional and current territories of the Coast Salish people, who have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. We acknowledge the role that traditional Western-centric planning practices have played in harming, displacing, and attempting to erase Native communities. We commit to identifying racist practices and strive to center restorative land stewardship rather than unsustainable and extractive use of the land. With that, welcome everybody to the May 23rd, 2024 meeting of the Seattle Planning Commission. We are happy to make all commission meetings open to the public. So for those of you listening in, welcome. Please note that the Planning Commission does not hold public hearings since the Commission is an advisory body. We provide recommendations to elected leaders that in turn make the actual decisions. We encourage individuals and organizations to provide their comments appropriately to elected officials. This meeting is a hybrid meeting with some individuals participating remotely, while others are participating in person in the Boards and Commission room at Seattle City Hall. I am going to ask Olivia to put the Color Brave space norms up on the screen. And I would like to invite a fellow commissioner to pick one of these and talk about its resonance to our conversation today. Looking at my list to see who is here, who hasn't gone. I know, Matt, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to highlight practice examining racially based systems. Systems are what is left after all the people in this room leave, which is especially poignant with regards to housing, the decisions that we make with regards to housing and new housing, where it goes, the impacts of growth reverberate for generations. And much of what we feel today is the result of inequitable practices in the past.
Thank you so much, Matt, for volunteering to go and for drawing that really resonant connection. Does anybody have any amendments that they want to suggest to the Color Brave space norms? No, so I suggest that we use and agree to these for our conversation today. Speaking of our conversation today, we just have one agenda item, which is a discussion on the draft housing appendix prepared as an accompanying document to the draft One Seattle plan. And we are joined here today by staff from the Office of Planning and Community Development. And I know lots of folks are eager to learn more about the housing appendix. So very excited about this conversation today. But before we get into that, we have our first and only formal action item for today, which is approval of the May 9th, 2024 meeting minutes. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
David will so move.
Rick seconds.
Rez seconds.
Ooh, Rick by a half second. Are there any changes or amendments? All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? And with that, the May 9th, 2024 meeting minutes are approved. We have a chair's report in regards to our upcoming commission meetings. Our next Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting is Thursday, June 6th from 7:30 to 9 a.m. And that meeting will be held online only using the MS Teams platform. And then we come back together as a full commission on Thursday, June 13th in the afternoon from 3 to 5:30 p.m. And that meeting will be a hybrid format with options for meeting in person in the Boards and Commissions room at Seattle City Hall or joining online via the MS Teams platform. I think Vanessa has a few announcements and commission business things to talk about. Vanessa, please take
Thanks,
it away.
Michaela.
Yeah.
Thank you. As Michaela noted, this is a hybrid meeting. All commissioners joining on the call right now are joining on the call remotely. Staff to the Planning Commission is here in the Boards and Commissions room in City Hall. During the meeting, there will be opportunities for questions and comments from commissioners. We're going to be using the chat function of MS Teams for all commissioners to join the discussion queue. I'd like to remind commissioners that the chat function is not for substantive discussion, but rather to be recognized to speak, as members of the public do not have access to the chat. I'm going to read the one public comment that was emailed to me prior to this meeting after we go through our introductions. We do not have any members of the public present here. If somebody should join us in the middle of the meeting and want to offer a public comment at the end, I will let you know, Chair Michaela. So with that, I'll ask Michaela to start the introductions. And as part of the introductions, please indicate your day job and, if desired or appropriate, any disclosure regarding your forthcoming comments during this meeting and if they represent your employer or not. And after introducing yourself, please call on a fellow commissioner to introduce themselves. If you're having trouble seeing who's on the call, just let me know and I will suggest a commissioner. So go ahead, Michaela.
All right, good morning. My name is Michaela Daffern. I am co-chair of the Seattle Planning Commission. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill and I work in affordable housing policy and planning for the King County Department of Community and Human Services. And my comments today are most definitely not the opinions of my employer. I'm speaking entirely on my own behalf. And with that, I will pass it over to David Goldberg, my co-chair.
Good morning. Thanks, Michaela. David Goldberg, he, him pronouns. I live in the Wallingford Urban Village. I work for the Washington State Department of Transportation. I have nothing to disclose and all my comments represent my own views and not that of the agency. And I will pass it to Caleb.
Good morning. My name is Caleb Twolday, he, him pronouns. I live in the Central District. And I work at Rainier Scholars with middle and high school scholars. And I have nothing to disclose, and I'll pass it to Jamie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jamie Strobel. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in the future 130th Station area. And I work for the Nature Conservancy of Washington as the climate director, and my views are my own and not that of my employer. And then I also have supported one of the community organizations that was funded to do community engagement for the comprehensive plan update. I'll pass to Rose.
Hi, good morning. I am Rose Lucello. It's in pronouns they, them. I live up in Licton Springs and I work as a wetland scientist and permitting specialist for Jacobs Engineering. I have no disclosures as well. And so that I will pass to Monica.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Sharma. I use she, her pronouns. I live in the Central District and I work for King County Play Equity Coalition. And I have nothing to disclose. So I will pass to Nick.
Good morning, Nick Whipple. I use he, him pronouns. I live in West Seattle in the North Del Ridge neighborhood. And for my day job, I am a city planner over in Bellevue. So obviously nothing to disclose on my end. Lauren?
Hey everyone, Lauren Squires, she, her. I live by the Mount Baker Light Rail Station and I work for King County Metro. My views are my own. Let's see. Matt.
Hi, my name is Matt Hutchins. I'm an architect. I live in West Seattle. Use he, him pronouns and nothing to disclose. I can't see if there's anyone else. Vanessa, can you help me out?
Absolutely. How about Rick?
Morning, everyone. I'm Rick Muller. I use he, him pronouns. I live north of the Wallingford Urban Village in the future Tangletown Neighborhood Center. I'm an architect, professor, and chair at the University of Washington. I have nothing to disclose. My views are my own, and I'll pass it to Deanna.
Good morning. My name is Diana Quintanar. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill. For my day job, I'm a multimodal transportation planner. For my day job, I work at WSP USA, and views are my own and not those of my employer.
How about Zio?
Good morning, Zio Alvarez. She, they pronouns. I live in White Center, Highland Park, and I am a designer at Element Architects, and all of my views are my own. Nothing to disclose. Andy?
Hi, Andy Dannenberg, he, him, Northeast Seattle, and I teach at University of Washington in public health and urban planning, and nothing to disclose. And I don't know who's left.
I think we are now at staff. Excuse me. Morning frog voice. Robin.
Robin McGonigal. I live on Vashon Island. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm staff.
Olivia.
Morning, everyone. Olivia Baker. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm staff to the planning commission. John?
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Hoy, staff to the Planning Commission. I use he, him pronouns.
And I'll wrap us up. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vanessa Murdoch. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm staff to the commission, executive director. And with that, we can move on to public comment. Michaela. Can
I'm
you
sorry.
read the
I can. It's getting warmed up this morning. With that, the commission provides time for public comment at all meetings. As a reminder, we do not hold public hearings and we are an advisory body. We make recommendations to elected officials who in turn make the actual decisions. Individuals who make comments to the commission should remember that the mayor and the city council make the decisions. We encourage individuals and organizations to provide their comments appropriately to those individuals. I invite individuals in the, Vanessa, is it a written public comment that you're reading into the record?
It is. We don't have any
Okay.
members of the public here.
Okay, thank you. If you would please read that.
I will do that. Thank you.
Okay.
The role of ADUs in addressing housing supply and the filtering process. Seattle's housing market faces a critical need for affordable family-style housing. The city's strategy to encourage accessory dwelling units, ADUs, construction following the 2019 deregulation aimed to address this by increasing supply. However, ADUs typically provide smaller studio-style homes, not the larger family-appropriate housing that's in high demand. The challenge is multifaceted, involving land, labor, regulations, and material costs. Today's market struggles with limited land, high labor costs, constraining regulations, and stagnant construction technology, leading to inflated costs and unaffordability. Seattle's ADU policy, while strategic, doesn't fully resolve this housing crisis. Effective solutions require a comprehensive approach, including regulatory reforms and policy changes to improve housing mobility and supply. Policies like fixed interest rates hinder the filtering process, where housing stock transitions between residents, by discouraging selling due to fixed property tax bases. Graphs from a similar city, San Francisco, show that new construction doesn't impact the number of real estate listings, indicating that building more homes doesn't necessarily meet demand. ADUs have benefits such as providing additional income for homeowners and accommodating elderly family members, but they alone cannot solve Seattle's housing issues. In conclusion, while ADUs contribute to diversifying housing options, Seattle needs a broader strategy involving regulatory changes and policy interventions to create more affordable family-style housing and make meaningful progress in resolving its housing challenges. Thank you for your time. Vincent Hestad. That concludes our public comment.
All right, thank you. With that, I think we will move on to our main agenda item of today, which is a discussion of the draft housing appendix. We have staff from the Office of Planning and Community Development who are here to present and discuss elements of the appendix, which was prepared as a companion analysis to the Draft 1 Seattle Plan. We have an hour and 10 minutes for this agenda item. And presenters, please leave 30 to 40 minutes for questions, comments, and discussions. And with that, I welcome Michael, Diana, and Philip.
Thank you, Michaela. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. And Diana, I'm just going to give just a quick introductory couple of words. This is you're mainly going to hear from Diana and Philip, who did the work on the housing appendix. I'm Michael Hubner, Long Range Planning Manager in the Office of Planning and Community Development and the project manager for the comp plan update, just to remind everybody who I am. And Diana and Philip are our data team for the comp plan update. And I am just so excited to share their work because I think it really is cutting edge work in the area of housing analysis, and hopefully sets a high bar for peer jurisdictions and help provide some models for the region in responding to new state law, mostly House Bill 1220, but other longstanding expectations of comprehensive plans, that we have a housing analysis that is part of the comp plan. So this is an appendix. It will be adopted with the comp plan itself. It contains much of the information that undergirds the policies that are in the housing element. So we put most of our data and analytics in the appendix, but they really do work very closely together. Looking forward to a conversation about how that interplay between the appendix and the policies, and any questions you have about the data, of course, and Diana and Philip will provide an overview. And thanks to the Commission for the comment letter on the draft plan. We very much appreciate and read with much interest your recommendations and comments. And I hope, one of my hopes for today's conversation is the housing appendix, like the draft plan itself, is a draft, and we will be making changes and building on what's in the draft. There may even be things that we even are aware of at this time, need a little bit more work and fleshing out for the final version. So I hope to hear from the Commission. This is a nice opportunity to let us know what improvements you would recommend seeing in the housing appendix itself between now and the final version that'll be available later this year. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diana and Philip. And if there are any policy related questions, I might chime in, but I'm going to step back and just listen and enjoy the time with you.
All right. Thank you so much for having us. I'm Diana Canzaneri, she, her pronouns, and city demographer in OPCD. Thank you for asking Philip and me to come and share highlights from the housing appendix that's part of the One Seattle draft plan. I'd like to provide a bit of context before we dive in. The findings we're highlighting today feature only a subset of the analysis that the housing appendix includes to address the now substantially expanded requirements for analysis on housing and comp plans set forth by GMA and the King County countywide policies. In full, the housing appendix is 170 pages. So we very much appreciate that Michaela and Olivia provided a list of topics to help us prioritize what we're addressing this morning. Also, Philip's and my work on the housing appendix is really focused on quantitative analysis. So that's what we'll be highlighting in the presentation itself. As Michael said, we welcome suggestions for the final housing appendix on any aspect. And I want to check with Philip. Are you able to share your screen?
Olivia, is it okay if I drive the car?
Yep, go ahead. You should be able to take over. If you have issues, let me know.
Okie dokie. Are you able to see my screen now?
It looks good.
Okay.
All right, so Philip, you're on for the first slide.
Wonderful. As Diana said, I am also on the team. So Philip Carnell, they, them, planning and equity data analyst. And the way that we are talking today, we wanted to kind of talk about one of the earlier sections to start, which is looking at the historical context of racist housing and land use practices. This was a section that was written by one of our colleagues that does a policy review of what racist housing policies have looked like in Seattle, basically since the first really white settlers came to the area, including topics such as the Black exclusion laws of the Oregon Territory, Treaty of Point Elliott, as well as some more local ones that include Ordinance of 5, the removal and exclusion of Indigenous people as the local law, federal, looking at HOLC maps, homeowners loan corporation maps such as the one that's here on the screen, as well as some private such as mortgage and lending practices. And part of the reason why we want to highlight this as well today is because many of the sections that we look at and that accompany this, that follow this policy review, look at ongoing disparities that are rooted in this history. This is also a new section that is required by House Bill 1220 as well too. And many of those disparities that we'll look at as well are also required, that we look at it at a kind of a cross-tabulated way that looks at things like disparities by race, homeownership and renter affordability by race, kind of a geographic analysis of racial and social equity in housing, as well as community indicator outcomes. And we'll cover the rest of those today in our presentation.
All right, fast forwarding to recent times. The decade between 2010 and 2020, as we've highlighted in the charts over on the right, was a period of especially rapid growth in Seattle, driven largely by our city's generally strong employment opportunities and high quality of life. Between 2010 and 2020, Seattle's population grew by 21%, which was significantly faster than growth in the remainder of King County and more than double Seattle's growth rate in each of the preceding decades. While Seattle added housing at a rapid pace, housing construction did not keep up with population or job growth. The 19% growth rate in housing units highlighted in the bottom chart was, in fact, just half the 38% rate of the increase in the number of jobs located in Seattle. Next slide, please. These next slides summarize patterns in Seattle's demographics. While local demographic characteristics provide insights into our housing needs, of course, Seattle's demographics are also shaped by the opportunities and constraints presented by the city's housing supply. Some key findings on the age distribution in Seattle. Children are an especially small share of our population in Seattle, while young adults are an especially large share. Children make up just 14% of Seattle's population, compared to 23% in the balance of King County. The only large city in the nation that's more childless than Seattle is San Francisco. The aging of the baby boom population is having a dramatic effect on our demographics. The population aged 65 and older in King County is forecast to grow by nearly 75% between 2022 and 2045. Accessible housing and services for this age group will need to expand accordingly. Next slide, please. Between 2010 and 2020, growth in Seattle's population of color occurred at 5 times the rate of the city's white population growth, but trends varied greatly by individual groups of color. Of particular concern, Seattle's Black population grew more slowly than the city's white population, and the numbers of Native American residents and Pacific Islander residents declined. Next slide. While people of color are a growing share of Seattle's population, the increase has been slower in Seattle than in the remainder of King County, especially among children. This suggests that households of color with children are finding it more difficult or less beneficial to move to or stay in Seattle. Some underlying factors are likely the especially high housing costs in Seattle, coupled with the low and declining share of reasonably affordable units in Seattle that are large enough to accommodate families with children. And in a few minutes, Philip is going to be diving into the details of the data on the housing supply. Next slide, please. In Seattle, family households, which may or may not include children by definition, and cohabiting couples together make up a little over half of Seattle's households. 7% of Seattle's households are roommate households, while nearly 41% are comprised of a person living alone. Next slide. 8% of Seattle households include one or more children, while 19% include one or more persons 65 years or older. Nearly half of households with a senior are comprised of an adult living alone. And an added note is that the aging of the baby boom is likely to drive Seattle's already strong demand for accessory dwelling units even higher. The average size of households in Seattle is 2.05. Seattle's actually been recording a gradual decrease in average household size, and this decrease has been happening for decades. However, the average household size in King County outside of Seattle followed a different path, increasing, actually, rather than decreasing, during each of the last 2 decades. And at 2.66, average household size in the remainder of King County is notably higher than in Seattle. Both census data and observations from community engagement suggest that the divergence in household size trends between Seattle and the rest of the county is at least partly a function of larger households' difficulty finding housing in Seattle that is affordable and large enough. Of course, this is a big racial equity issue, as the average family size is about 30% higher in families of color compared to families with a white householder. The need for housing suited to multi-generational housing was also a theme heard from communities of color during public engagement. In Seattle and King County, census stats show that Pacific Islander households and Native American households are more than 5 times as likely to have generations extending beyond a parent-child relationship. Next slide. This chart looks at how household income distribution has changed in Seattle over a roughly 10-year period. The height of the bars shows the change in the share of households in each income category. The blue bars represent renter households, the orange owners, and the gray renter and owner households combined. Incomes in Seattle have become more polarized. This includes a substantial increase in the share of households who have incomes over 120% of AMI. A decline in the 50 to 80% of AMI category. This was actually the only income band with a decline in both the number and the proportion of households. Several factors likely contributed to this polarization, including growth in high-wage jobs and challenges faced by low and moderate income households when competing for housing with higher income households. And yes, low income households are much more likely to shoulder affordable housing costs. Roughly 75% of households in extremely low and very low income categories are spending more than 30% of their income on monthly housing costs. And underlying underlining the depth of need among extremely low income households is the fact that roughly 6 in 10 of these households are spending more than half of their income on housing. Next slide. Every measure related to housing opportunity that we cross-tabulated with race showed race-based inequities. Native Americans and Black households are the groups most disproportionately and severely impacted by housing costs. And next slide. Owning the home in which one lives is uncommon for most groups of color, especially for Hispanic, Native American, Black, and Pacific Islander households. And of note, data for Seattle shows an especially steep decline in home ownership among Black households over the last 30 or so years. Next slide. And this is actually on to you, Philip.
Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about the housing supply and market analysis. And for these next few slides, I want to mention that we took a very specific strategic direction on how we're looking at this data, choosing to use a variety of administrative and private sources, including from the King County tax assessors to look at supply and sale, our internal Excel reporting system to look at permitting, as well as looking at Zillow and CoStar for home valuations and rent trends. So we accompany all of these alongside as well the American Community Survey data and use each of them when appropriate. So this first slide that we're looking at is the existing housing supply. And I want to make note that what we found were about 54% of Seattle's housing units are flats, so multifamily flats. Usually these could be in multifamily as well as mixed-use buildings. Roughly a third of our housing supply is detached homes, while about 10% would be between townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. This first bullet here is one of the key takeaways, is that single unit homes account for just about 40% of the total housing supply. One unit, including both one unit attached, such as townhouses or attached accessory dwelling units, or one unit meaning a detached home as well. But buildings with 50 or more units also have about a third of the overall housing supply, and really are comprised of just over 1,000 buildings in the city. This next bullet down here, which I've also updated the chart on the right, talks about the spread of these different types of housing by the number of bedrooms that are typically in them. And what we find is that 3/4 of the existing flats in the city are studios or have just one bedroom. In general, townhouses tend to be kind of between the 2 and the 3 bedroom, and a majority of 3+ bedrooms are detached homes. Virtually all in 4 or more bedrooms, having 4 or more bedrooms, are detached homes. This is both an interplay with regulations as well as the market and what the size of these units might look like, as well as where they might be built. In addition to what we're seeing here, Seattle has about 21,000 congregate residences and types of housing such as group homes, dormitories, assisted living facilities, and certain institutional facilities. This slide looks at what our development has looked like since the last comprehensive plan update in 2015. And we really highlight 3 key takeaways in this section, being strong overall production, a range of new construction types, and that much of the development was in small units and big buildings. So strong overall production from about 2016 through 2022, we had a net addition of 58,000 housing units. This is looking at the number of units that were finalized in our permitting system, minus those that were demolished. As we can see in the chart on the right, these were highly concentrated in multifamily and mixed use types for the units. For new construction types, part of what we're looking at here is how DADUs and ADUs, in particular since the 2019 reforms, have been added to the housing supply. So much and so that when combined, they outnumber the number of detached homes that have been built since 2015. Finally, the small units and big buildings, we found a couple of key takeaways here, and that 2/3 of the units built were 0 or 1 bedroom units, and nearly all of those units that were 0 or 1 bedroom were in multifamily or mixed use flats. In addition, over 70% of new units are in the range of buildings that have 50 or more units inside of them. So from here, I'm going to transition away from the supply and look more at market factors. And I wanted to start by kind of saying this upfront from the Zillow Home Value Index that we found. And it showed that lower cost homes tripled in value in the city from 2012 to 2022. This is a key factor because that lower third means that many low income and first time home buyers are priced out of the local ownership market. And this, of course, has racial impacts as well, too. So this table on the right is the output of an analysis that we conducted on sales in Seattle in 2022, recorded by the King County tax assessors. And we use a mortgage model then to understand how those sale prices might relate to affordability and AMI. What we find as an outcome of this is that ownership housing that is not income restricted is rarely affordable to households at or below 120% of AMI. Smaller unit types, as well as older unit types, so smaller unit types potentially looking at things like multifamily units or accessory dwelling units, and older building types like older multifamily homes and sometimes even older detached homes, can be much closer to affordability of 120% of AMI, but nothing is, or not rarely, they are below, I would say. In addition, we look at these home sale prices and we cross-tabulate it with consideration for white households, people of color households, and for all households. And we find that ultimately the cost of homeownership is prohibitive to most Seattle households today, but it is also more prohibitive to households of color. Looking at the rental market, we use a mixture of CoStar and American Community Survey data for this different analyses. There's a handful of different analyses that are inside of the housing appendix here. And I wanted to highlight this first key takeaway, similar and parallel to the homeownership market, that average monthly gross rents in Seattle grew 81% from just under $1,000 in 2010 to nearly $1,800 in 2021. We further use American Community Survey data to start to understand how rents by unit types might look throughout the city. And we find that renters of one-unit homes, and that could be detached or townhomes as well too, are paying a large premium to live in larger units and also in neighborhoods that fit their needs. For a one-unit detached home, it's about 45% higher than the average monthly gross rent. And for an attached home, it's about 25% higher. We also, again, cross-tabulate these by income and race, and we find that less than half of Seattle households can reasonably afford the median gross rent of a one-bedroom unit, and an even smaller share of BIPOC families can afford units due to racial income disparities. Finally, we spotlight a lot of apartment data throughout this section with key findings that we're using CoStar data for. And what we find is that when looking at age, older apartments provide a really critical supply of units that may be affordable to households at or below 80% of AMI. And in this sense, I'm strictly talking about ones that are not income restricted. Newer apartments that are not income restricted vary in affordability really by the number of bedrooms, and with multi-bedroom apartments being largely unaffordable to lower or even sometimes middle income households. Overall, this figure on the right shows that looking at our entire apartment supply, just 7.5% of apartments are multi-bedroom and affordable to households with income at or below 80% of AMI. At this point, I'll hand it back to Diana.
All right, thank you. Another way to get insights into Seattle's rental market is to look at whether people working in various occupations can afford the rents being charged. This slide illustrates that workers in many essential occupations are unable to afford the average rent for a studio. For example, a full-time child care worker earning the average for that occupation would be unable to affordably rent a studio. Same for dual earner households with a part-time wait person and a part-time bank teller. Next slide. Here we see examples of workers in households that, along with all the examples on the previous slide, wouldn't be able to afford an average cost one-bedroom apartment. For example, a household where the sole wage earner is a bus driver or a social worker wouldn't be able to afford to rent the average one-bedroom apartment. The same is true of a dual earner household where each earner is working full-time and is paid Seattle's minimum wage. Next slide. Here we see examples of several occupations in which a solo wage earner could not afford an average two-bedroom apartment. These examples include firefighters and school teachers. Many dual earner households, like a full-time admin assistant and a part-time hairdresser, they're also unable to swing a two-bedroom unit. Something to keep in mind is that households, of course, may have dependents as well as employed people, and such households, as well as roommate households, typically need at least two bedrooms. All of the examples that we've seen so far, regardless of whether they include dependents like children or not, would not be able to afford an average two-bedroom apartment in the city. And back to you, Philip.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about our housing needs as well as the barriers to housing development at all income levels. And in this section, we're talking about things that might be barriers to meeting specifically the projected housing needs that are allocated to the city of Seattle through 2044. At our last presentation to the Planning Commission, we kind of did a deep dive into the workings and the assumptions of the land capacity analysis. As we discussed in that meeting, the results found that Seattle has sufficient zoned development capacity to accommodate the projected housing needs allocated to City of Seattle through 2044. However, we want to highlight that capacity alone is insufficient to addressing our housing needs, meaning those actual projected needs, as well as the goals that we set forth in our housing element moving forward. We provide a review and analysis in several sections of the housing appendix that go into these specific topics about what those barriers might be. That includes a housing production and barriers actions, which provides a list of barriers that are applicable to potentially all development types in Seattle, as well as actions that the city is taking to reduce those barriers. We also have a subsection of our income restricted housing section that provides for funding of production and preservation, specifically of income restricted housing, as well as the operation and maintenance of income restricted housing. Both of these sections were joined in writing by policy staff as well as staff from OH in writing and conducting these analyses. There are some other sections throughout the housing appendix that Diana and myself did work on that touch on barriers as well as reaching those goals, such as the locations of job and housing, the development capacity and housing units with proximity to frequent and high capacity transit, as well as these next sections where we go into the diversity and growth amongst different neighborhoods within Seattle. So one of those I'm going to touch on is this next slide here, which is one of the subsections in our larger geographic analysis of racial and social equity in housing. This one specifically shows the growth and diversity in urban centers and urban villages. As urban centers and urban villages have been our centers of growth since the 1990s, and we saw rapid population growth in the last decade, this is also reflected in the urban center growth and population here. And we look at this in particular by people of color, white population, then total growth, as well as housing growth between 2010 and 2020, both inside of urban centers and urban villages and outside of urban centers and urban villages. What we found was that the growth between 2010 and 2020 was disproportionate for Seattle's residents of color inside of urban centers and urban villages, and it was disproportionately higher than white non-Hispanic residents. Speaking to this section, it shows the net change in population of all urban centers and urban villages. It does not show some other items that we touch on in different sections of the housing appendix, as well as forthcoming appendices to the comp plan itself. So number one, it wouldn't show differentiation between regions as well as racial groups in the city, which we touch on in a different subsection of the geographic analysis, both being changes in racial and ethnic makeup of Seattle's neighborhood. It doesn't also, this table doesn't tell us about displacement and where it's happening, especially low-income people of color, which we touch on in our displacement section of the housing appendix. And it also doesn't look at disaggregated demographic and housing data at the center level, which will be forthcoming in the urban center profiles that will be adopted as part of the final comprehensive plan. So at this point, I'll hand it back to Diana to go over another section of the geographic analysis of racial and social equity in housing, the equitable development community indicators findings.
All right, and this is the final part of our presentation, and we're actually going to be segueing into some questions we want to pose to you. So a key principle in the countywide planning policies is supporting more affordable and equitable access to neighborhoods with key components of livability, including well-funded schools, open space, good environmental quality, good transit service, and nearby employment. The CPPs call upon jurisdictions to monitor and work to eliminate disparities in neighborhood access. The city's Equitable Development Monitoring Program, which we launched in 2020, in part to inform and gauge ongoing progress in implementing the comprehensive plan, is something that helps fulfill this responsibility from the King County planning policies. One of the things that Michaela and Olivia specifically asked us to cover from our housing appendix is a set of highlights from this monitoring work. And related to that, they asked how the Planning Commission can support our ongoing monitoring. One key way that you can support this is providing your advice. So after briefly summarizing findings from the monitoring that we released in 2020, we're going to ask the Commission for some early advice on how we can enhance the set of indicators we're analyzing to monitor progress in advancing equity in the implementation of the One Seattle plan. Our equitable development monitoring includes tracking 21 community indicators that were selected based on community engagement and advice from boards and commissions, particularly from the Planning Commission and the EDI Advisory Board. We organized the indicators under 4 themes: home, community, transportation, and education and economic development. On the housing front, we monitor home ownership, housing cost burden, and supply measures, including affordability and availability, family size rental housing, and rent and income restricted housing. Next slide. And for these indicators, we measure race-based disparities in the city as a whole, and we analyze indicators to see where there are neighborhood-based disparities, paying particular attention to our racial and social equity priority areas, which are cross-hatched on this map in gold. These are areas where RSJI populations make up relatively large proportions of neighborhood residents, particularly this is based on our racial and social equity index. This index combines demographics related to race with data on socioeconomic disadvantage and health disadvantage. Next slide. So briefly showing you a couple of the maps that we have in our 2020 monitoring report. The map on the left shows the share of rental units in each tract that can be afforded with an income at or below 80% of AMI. While scarce overall, rentals affordable to low-income households are more common in most racial and social equity priority areas than elsewhere in the city. However, several RSC priority areas, including neighborhoods in the central area, have a relatively low share of affordable units, making it increasingly hard for historical communities to remain. The map on the right shows where rent and income restricted housing is located. Approximately 2/3 of these units are in RSC priority areas, which in part reflects investment in subsidized housing as an anti-displacement strategy. However, the concentration of units inside RSC priority areas also reflects that zoning in many other neighborhoods prohibits density, development at densities needed to make construction of income restricted housing feasible. Next slide. This slide summarizes findings on other community indicators of equitable development. RSE priority areas generally have as good or sometimes better geographic access to frequent transit service, jobs accessible via transit, and city-owned community centers and libraries. At the same time, RSE priority areas face disproportionately high risk of exposure to air pollution from heavily traveled roadways and industry. Also, RSE priority areas are less likely to include neighborhood elementary schools that score high on quality measures, are among the areas with the greatest need for more and bigger parks, and include areas that lack a nearby grocery store selling fruits and vegetables. Next slide. In a moment, we're going to pose some questions to get your advice on the monitoring that OPCD should do on a continuing basis to gauge progress in advancing equity and implementing the One Seattle plan. I just want to note really briefly that the Equitable Development Community Indicators are part of a broader suite of monitoring reports and tools that we produce in OPCD. They include reporting on displacement risk and neighborhood change, as well as monitoring focus specifically on growth, particularly in urban centers and villages. And next slide. We do realize that you may have questions for us and particular, things that you want to discuss about issues that were brought up. We are hoping that as part of the discussion, as we gear up to resume monitoring to gauge progress on advancing equity and implementing the comp plan, you can help us by giving us some feedback on what topics and metrics would be especially important to include in our ongoing monitoring. And, from reading the Commission's recommendations, we know you support monitoring outcomes in the racial and social equity priority areas and really focusing on those. We're also wondering about what geographies and place types in the growth strategy you would recommend we also include in monitoring. And with that wraps up our presentation.
Well, thank you so much. I don't know if others find that presentation as riveting as I did. Perhaps it's just kind of my wonky jam, but I just want to start with a compliment to staff. This is a stellar component, in my opinion, of the work that staff has done related to the comprehensive plan. And OPCD and the mayor and council should be proud that they have staff like you supporting them. It's incredibly thoughtful work and very, very helpful for folks who are actually trying to evaluate the plan and determine whether or not it's helping us as a city to meet our housing needs gaps in a way that's equitable. And I'll just pull forward a comment that Rick just dropped into the chat, both riveting and sobering, which it is. And I think sometimes we, as folks who live in this city, know this stuff, right? Like we see this stuff play out every day, we feel it, but it is sometimes very helpful to have data to underpin our understanding of the issue and to help give us a more nuanced understanding of it. So with that, I want to say thank you. I think we have these two discussion questions that you have posed, and I know that Michael Hubner at the beginning did also say, what would we like to see added to the housing appendix in the final version? So I think that's a third question out there. And then just other reflections and observations from commissioners on what they've heard today. So with that, I'm going to ask folks to start putting their name in the chat for people who want to talk. I suggest we start with question 1, which is what topics and metrics are most important to include in monitoring? David.
I was sure I wasn't going to be the first one, but so many things. But regarding that first question, I guess it's the second two. So it looks like preserving existing affordable or relatively affordable apartments, older apartments, should be a key strategy because it's one of the few sort of hopeful spots if you're looking for a place to live in Seattle. Are we currently monitoring our preservation of older apartments? And I can't recall whether there was any strategies in the comp plan, but it seems like we should be thinking in that direction.
We have not been measuring that specifically in our monitoring. And I am taking down your suggestion. And then as far as policies, Michael may know the answer to that question.
Yeah, yes, there's policy language in the housing element that broadly supports preservation. I think on the implementation front, having good data about where those properties are and what level of affordability. Diana, just quick clarification. I recall that in recent years there have been efforts to try to get a handle on sort of live real-time data on affordable market rate housing. That is a difficult. That's a challenging area of monitoring. Correct? I mean, that's not. It's not that we're not doing it because we don't want to do it. We're not doing it because it's difficult to do. Correct?
Yeah, and actually the CoStar data that we have can help us do that. And there's data that speaks to like that Philip was showing, that we could potentially include in an ongoing metric for monitoring. So we really appreciate that suggestion.
One way that we could get that data is to have that be reported by property owners when they register their rental units. Seattle has a rental registry requirement. I don't believe that we collect that type of information. I think it's mostly more so we're trying to figure out who the point of contact is in those buildings. But a rental registry could include reporting of rents, although that hasn't, that adds burden to both the landlords and folks at the Seattle Department of Construction Inspections. All right, Deanna, you're next.
Thank you. Really world-class analysis. I've not seen anything done like this around the world, so very impressed and grateful to have this and appreciate your all's thoughtfulness. I think that in terms of the first question that is up here on the screen, what topics and metrics are most important to include in monitoring? What I've seen around the world be a very valuable insight is to, I understand that this is kind of really focused on housing, but to truly understand the burdens on particularly low-income households and households of color, it would be very valuable to understand this data by matching up by decile of income, both housing and transportation costs, because worldwide in urban areas, those are the two main costs that really tilt the needle in terms of access to other opportunities and livability index development and that I've seen. So, a comprehensive livability index is what I would love to see for Seattle, right? That like takes into consideration by income level, by race, cost for health, education, food, access to food, those kinds of things. But to keep it, at least a good incremental step in that direction is understanding housing costs, transportation costs, because we all know, and we're seeing it happen here from my native city in Mexico City. I'm starting to see what happened in Mexico City happen here, which is lower income households live further apart because they can access, more affordable housing out, which then translates to the jobs staying still inside of the city. These individuals having to travel for longer, right, and pay a lot more in transportation. So cost of time, cost of actual transportation cost, and housing burden. Really, you ask yourself, if you were in that situation, what access to what opportunities can you have after that, right? So I think that would be very enlightening to really understand how to couple up our transportation and housing policies together to have kind of like a complete picture, particularly at the income level.
Yeah, I want to make one quick thank you for that. It's a great point. Something we looked into with the community indicators report earlier before the comp plan shows that the biggest thing that we can do to reduce the overall cost burden of housing plus transportation is ensure that people are not displaced out of the city altogether because
Absolutely.
of the drop off and access to transit is precipitous at the border of the city if you look regionally. So really important. Not a lot of variability in transportation cost within the city, although I'm not saying it's not relevant, but once you displace people outside of the city, it becomes a much bigger issue, the transportation piece. But thank you for that.
Given that we only have about 20 more minutes, I'm going to let folks say whatever they want so that everybody who's put their name in the queue has at least an opportunity to comment on and remark on whatever struck them. So I'm just letting commissioners know that you can opine on whatever you want to. And with that, I'm going to call on Andy next.
Yeah, hi. I had a question about ADUs. It looks like they're a relatively small number of units. Do you see a role that could be larger, or are there streamlining issues that would make it easier? And just where do they fit into the picture? So.
Diana, that's probably something, since that's a forward-looking policy question, I think the ADU, so first of all, the fact that ADUs have been a growing portion of housing production is important. It tells us something about market demand for alternative homes of a certain size at a better affordability level through new construction in neighborhood residential areas. So that's feeding into our work on the middle housing on the HB 1110 implementation through new zoning and neighborhood residential. And going forward, we're working on how to integrate accessory dwelling units into that broader picture of allowing multiple units and multiple configurations on neighborhood residential lots. There will continue to be a role. It's a requirement of GMA, but in the grand scheme of things, the middle housing types, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and others will be really where the action is in our neighborhood residential areas, and the ADUs as such will be much less crucial to providing those housing options.
Are there streamlining issues that would make it easier for people who do want to, add them to an existing place?
That's something we're looking at in designing the new neighborhood residential zoning. It's one of the factors we're considering, because we're going to be replacing that code entirely, the neighborhood residential code. So it's part of the mix.
All right, Monica.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I just want to echo all the compliments that have been said. I really appreciate it. I am coming from the perspective of play for young people and access to movement. And there was mentioned access to parks and open space. And I'm just curious how y'all are planning to get that, like what kind of data that will look like and what kind of proximity you're looking at. We lean on the 10-minute walk from parks and open space as, that kind of like the correct shed for actual access to parks and open space, but also the quality of that walk can vary pretty significantly. And just emphasizing the importance of access to movement for young people as a public health indicator, I think is really crucial.
Yeah, and we have an incredibly rich data set that our colleague Casey James developed for outside citywide, and that Philip is going to be maintaining. And it includes not only, proximity to parks and the size of parks, but also the qualities within the parks, including, what amenities are there, Philip, do you have anything to add on that?
I can't speak directly to what with what the exact walkshed is on it today, but I can say that that is in the documentation on the outside citywide dashboard as well. And just as Diana has said, I will be working on maintaining that as a project into the future. It looks at both private and publicly owned, as well as quality, as well as you know, combinations where there's kind of a neighborhood park system that might be connected to each other. One of the things that it doesn't necessarily look at is, say, just standalone trails that would connect from one park to a next. It's also about where there's space to really be able to sit and enjoy a park. So maybe not all of the things that would be trails that might be directly correlated to movement would pop up in there.
Great, thank you both so much.
And Vanessa, what did you just drop into the chat as a link?
Just typing madly, but not fast enough. It's to the outside citywide dashboard that Philip and Diana spoke to. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And the trail systems connecting different neighborhood parks together, I'll also say provide an opportunity for increasing pollinator habitat or other sort of neighborhood goals around community connectivity and habitat quality for birds and bees and people. So I think up next we have Rick.
Morning, thank you both for that presentation. I'm sure all of us are looking forward to getting our hands on the report and digging into it in greater detail. I can just say anecdotally, part of my responsibilities as chair of the Department of Architecture at the UW is to hire new faculty, and we do so by conducting an international search. These are highly competitive positions, and I will tell you, housing costs in Seattle are killing us. It is having a devastatingly negative impact on our ability to recruit the best and brightest to the university. So I'm one of several 65-year-old or older members of the Planning Commission, and we are also homeowners because we had the good fortune of moving here when housing was affordable. I'm wondering if we are tracking the percentage of people in that age group, which will grow substantially, who are in fact downsizing. You mentioned ADUs, but it would be interesting to have more data on that. And my other question is, are we using public funds like relief on property taxes to in fact disincentivize downsizing to free up larger family-sized units that are clearly desperately needed in the city?
I remember one of the recommendations in the Planning Commission's family size housing action agenda was specifically along the lines of helping seniors downsize. We don't have the specific like longitudinal data that we would need to track downsizing. I would love to have that. There's some other we can look at net changes in data to some degree. I'm writing that down. Maybe one of the faculty members, if you can recruit them, could look at that question. That's really a juicy question. And then your other question or comment, I think, is maybe a Michael one.
Briefly, well, that's a fascinating question, Rick. In that we much more commonly have heard through our engagement with the public concerned about displacement of older residents on a fixed income from their existing homes, and that property tax relief can play a role there. So there's real tension there, I think, in your question between addressing that concern and the value that our larger existing housing stock can play in meeting future housing need. I'll just I'll pose this as an architectural question for you and your colleagues, which is, part of what we're trying to do with the plan is provide options that are attractive and meet the needs of households that may want to downsize. And I think part of what's going on, and someone noted that that demographic is not leaving their homes, and clearly many of them don't want to, is that there aren't as many or the types of alternative housing choices within the city that people would like to see and would move to. So that's a broad goal, and let's keep working together to crack that nut. It's a tough one. I want to live in my house for many, many years personally, but maybe if I saw, or you and your household saw options that are really attractive, that might be a different future.
And I'd just like to add really fast on this one as well too. We do, in addition to the downsizing question, we do have sections that discuss things like multi-generational houses as well too, households now, which is of course kind of a part of that trend, as maybe adult children are not able to purchase their own homes in the city or even in the region. And then also in addition to downsizing, there are other forms of housing that we touch on that we also have a deficit into, that, as Michael was talking on, that could be appropriate housing that might be preventing from people moving away from their detached home.
Well, thank you all.
Rose, and I'll just note we have 10 minutes left and folks that are in the queue.
Sure. Yeah, so my comment has to do with finding ways to measure choice, not just by housing type, but by neighborhood, by access to opportunity and all that. Because when I was listening to you talk about where people are concentrated and where these RSE priorities are, it struck me that there's usually like several types of people. There's the people who want to stay in place and they want the city to listen to fix things like solving pollution, having good access to transit without sacrificing health, stuff like that, or, climate resilient strategies in areas prone to flooding. But there are also the people who want the ability to move to other neighborhoods. And so when I think about choice, I would encourage the city to consider, well, what does choice look like depending on who you are and how can we measure it?
Thank you.
All right, Matt.
I want to echo everyone's plaudits about the quality of this analysis. I just love being able to parse the demographics across different housing types and the housing stock and rental, and I mean there's so much data here. It's really just wonderful. So I'm sharing Michaela's geeking out love of this. One thing I wanted to, point out is that in the housing appendix, the only segment that really supports 50 to 80% AMI affordable or income restricted housing creation is in the 50 to 85 foot zoning, and the prime place to expand this, where we're not tearing down existing apartments that are already providing less expensive rentals, is in creating new zones for that scale building. And I would think that these are in the neighborhood centers. And so I want to make sure that neighborhood centers have that kind of zoning and a lot of it. But when you overlay the RSE map with the neighborhood centers that were not included between the draft and the final plan, 13 of them disappeared. And so I wonder whether we're not starving the areas that may need housing the most, affordable housing the most, by not providing the kind of zoning that provides these 50 to 85 foot tall buildings in those neighborhood centers that may never happen. So so I would love to see more of those come back and have those be overlaid on the RSE map. I also want to echo quickly that we've had in the last 2 years 3 staff leave because they couldn't afford to have a family, so they've left for less expensive markets. So it's having a huge impact on our my little company. So I'm sure it's happening broadly. And then my third point is just that when ADUs are counted towards HB 1110's 4 and 6 unit density count, it's effectively saying to the marketplace, well, don't build ADUs, build townhouses. So I think that what has been a fantastic new market for housing, way to leverage our neighborhood residential areas, is essentially going to get kneecapped by not including ADUs in, or by including ADUs as sort of part of the baseline density. That's it. Thanks.
Matt, I'm sorry you felt rushed for those comments. I think we all have a lot to say today, a lot of feelings in response to the data that was presented. I do want to just, for the record, out loud say that there was, Caleb said in the chat box, +1 to Rose's comment, and a couple of us other commissioners also sort of gave that a thumbs up. So it just that comment was particularly on point. And I think, you know, housing choice is not just about the choice to stay within your community, but the choice to live in any neighborhood in Seattle, regardless of what your income is. All right, Zio, you're up.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate the presentation. I'm excited to dig into this more. I think that something that was in a bunch of conversations we had while we were reviewing the draft comp plan was how the comp plan describes and defines family housing in the city. And I think a lot of the analysis here and I'm really interested in the analysis here around the ability for families and children to grow in the city. I think there's an ongoing conversation around what the future of public schools is here and what childcare looks like for young families here. And I think it's really challenging to imagine a future raising a family here personally, based on some of those conversations today. And so I'm really interested in how we expand, one, like what we consider family housing in the city, and two, like where that housing is located in proximity to, you know, things like good schools, good parks, and giving families the ability to access services within the city and not feel like they need to go elsewhere. It feels like that's something that is largely focused on largely leaning on home ownership right now, and that just doesn't feel like it gives credit to like the variety of families that are currently raising kids in the city today.
I'm writing notes as fast as I can. Thank you so much for all of your comments and suggestions.
Oh, I love your cat background, Philip. Thank you for that sneak peek into your personal loves.
Did I accidentally just flash that when moving my mouse? It happens.
So we have about 4 minutes left, and my personal feeling is I feel like we scratched the surface of this and we didn't really even get sufficiently into some of the more technical questions around the monitoring and then what geographies and place types and the growth strategy do we recommend including in the monitoring. So perhaps Vanessa and Olivia and the co-chairs of the Housing and Neighborhoods Committee, perhaps this is a conversation we could continue in one of those committee meetings. I think this is an area rich of it for exploration. I will also just note that we said in our letter that we were hoping that the comprehensive plan itself would articulate metrics and measures of success within the plan. So it was sort of clear what success looks like to the mayor and the council and us as a commission. And I think that your the information on the prior slide could be a starting point for thinking through what kind of metrics you would embed within the growth strategy and land use and housing components of the comprehensive plan. So yes, I want to see monitoring that's robust, but I also think it's really helpful to kind of try and put some numeric goals around what we're trying to achieve by 2044 in the comprehensive plan related to housing. So Vanessa, does that suggestion comport with what you as staff were thinking the committee might take on in the next month or so?
Yes, I'm looking at Olivia. We were also thinking about having a conversation around the anti-displacement framework, but the timing might be better to continue this conversation at the June Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting, which is June 6th, I think. And maybe the July Housing and Neighborhood Committee conversation is around the anti-displacement framework.
All right,
that's off the top of my head.
Yeah, I trust we can talk about it more in executive committee, but whatever timing makes the most sense for both of those work products. I know that we are also sort of eager to understand and shape the commentary on the displacement framework as well. So we can pick that up maybe at our next executive committee meeting.
Sounds good.
All right. Do we have any further folks in the room or online who've submitted public comment?
No public comment.
All right. Well, with that, everybody, thank you so much for joining us bright and early, OPCD staff, and thank you for the commissioners for being so engaged in the discussion today. And the meeting of the May 23rd Planning Commission meeting is adjourned.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
See
That's
ya.
all.